Hello knitters, Barbara Benson here. I'm an independent knitwear designer who also likes to make videos here on my YouTube channel, Watch Barbara Knit. Make sure to check in the description notes below the video where you will find links to all of my online shenanigans, including how to get my patterns to knit up for yourself, how to join the Watch Barbara Knit Facebook group, how to support me on Patreon, and where to get Watch Barbara Knit merchandise. Today, the subject matter was inspired by a comment in the Watch Barbara Knit Facebook group, and it's kind of almost like an excuse, so I'm going to show you the comment that we have here. And this lovely member of the group said, "I'm almost done with my swatch for Rev It Up. How hard do I wet block it? Do I want to stretch it or just smooth it out? Thanks." And if you have been watching me for any length of time, or if you've been in any of the live streams that we do at the end of the month, you'll know that I like talking about gauge. I have made videos on gauge. I will put links in the description notes to videos on gauge I have made. But you know what? It doesn't hurt to talk about gauge again. Let's talk about gauge, baby. Sorry. So here's the thing. Gauge swatches are really important and really despised in the knitting, and I also assume crochet communities, because most people really just want to get to it. Most people really just want to be able to start on the project that they very much are wanting to make. But if you want that project to be successful, if you want your sweater to fit, if you want your shawl to drape beautifully, if you want your socks to fit your foot and not be too long or have a heel in the middle of your instep, there are any number of things that can go awry if your gauge is off. Things come out too small, things come out too big, things come out too stiff, too floppy. There's so many things. And taking some time to actually do a proper gauge swatch can save you a whole world of misery and a lot of time, because it takes less time to knit and properly prepare a swatch than it does to re-knit or frog large portions of a project. So it's kind of like the whole measure twice, cut once kind of situation, because you just really just do a gauge swatch. That's the thing. But let's talk about, I wanted to give some tips on your gauge swatch and things to think about, because I don't think that maybe we talk about it enough. And I know that, again, I've made videos on this, but if this redundant video reaches one person that maybe hasn't seen my other videos, then I think that maybe I will have been a success. So making a gauge swatch is about making sure that the yarn you have chosen is going to be a successful pairing for the pattern you have chosen. And it's not just about weight, but not most patterns. You're not going to do excessive swatching in cables and lace and stuff like that, but you could if you wanted to. And they're mostly about size. And what this gauge is, one of those words that can have multiple meanings. And what we're talking about here was the gauge swatch. It is the sample piece of knitting that you create and then measure to ensure, as I said, this yarn needle combination is going to work in your pattern. And that is one of my first big things. And I have a little bit of notes just to make sure. And it's not again, it's a little bit of notes. It's just like prompts for myself, bullet points, if you will. You need to create your gauge swatch, to knit your gauge swatch as you are going to knit and produce your final project. Okay? That means you're going to knit that gauge swatch with the same yarn. This is the yarn you're going to use for the project. The same needles and the same knitting technique. And what I mean by that is if the project is knit flat, then you knit your swatch flat. If the project is knit in the round, then you need to swatch in the round, because the gauge can be different and is frequently different knit flat versus knitting in the round because of a very specific reason. When you knit stockinette flat, you are knitting the right sides and purling the wrong sides. When you knit stockinette in the round, you are knitting every single round. And your tension between your knit and your purl stitch for most knitters is different. So your tension between a flat swatch and a in the round swatch can be substantially different. And speaking of in the round, you really need to make sure you're using the seam. Again, you wouldn't want to knit a swatch in the round with DPNs if you are going to knit your project in the round with a circular needle, because the technique you use, how you hold those needles, how you tension your yarn is going to be different on DPNs versus magic loop. Or just being a circular knitting, this is going to be particularly important in socks, because, you know, in theory, you could like do your swatch for your socks using DPNs, but then decide you're going to use one of those little tiny 9-inch circulars. Your tension's going to be different because the way you hold those needles is going to be different. So you can't swap out your, well, I don't want to say can't, because you can do whatever you want. You're the boss of your knitting. And if you like living dangerously, you go for it. But it is inadvisable to swap out the needle willy-nilly, because the type, and I'm talking about at all. Okay, say you are going to knit the project and you're swatching with a size 7 needle, and you have a size 7 haya and a size 7 chaogu, right? But the chaogu happens to be in another project that's almost done. So you do your swatch with a haya, but then you decide you want to do the project with a chaogu. Your gauge might be different, okay? Because the needles are different. Needle manufacture is not like high precision. I mean, it is. They're very, you know, you got your little circular things that you measure them with, but it's not like they're making sewing machines or something that has to like run, or a watch. They have tolerances. And so your hayas might be different than your chaogus, or you might even be looking at a chaogu versus like a zing, and one is stainless steel and one is aluminum, and one has pointy tips and one has blunt tips. How you use that needle, how it works in your hands, is going to cause you to hold it differently and have different tension. While we're on this subject, and this is another one of my points, you really cannot change needle material, because the gauge you get on a wooden versus a bamboo versus an acrylic versus a stainless steel versus an aluminum versus a nickel plated versus what have you, whatever kind of needle material your needle is made out of, is going to tension differently. You're going to hold it differently. The yarn is going to move on it differently. And that means, like, if it's a stickier needle, if it's a grabbier needle, then you're actually going to unconsciously hold your yarn looser so that it slides more frequently. And that will usually result in a larger gauge. So you can't switch out the materials and expect to have the same results. But on the plus side, if you are swatching for something and your gauge is off with that needle by like, you're like, oh, I need to go up or down, but only like a half a needle size, switching material might do it for you. In general, as I said, the grabbier the needle, the looser you hold the yarn, the larger your gauge is going to be. And the slicker the needle, the the tighter you pull your yarn, because it slides more easily, and that's going to give you a slightly tighter gauge. So if you're at one spot and you're using a metal needle and you needed to go up, then switching to a wooden or a bamboo needle might shift you just enough. This is also a way that you might be able to achieve a different row gauge, because I know getting a row gauge for a lot of people is a challenge. And again, using the same needle size but shifting your materials might actually get you where you need to go. And then in this whole idea of you have to create your swatch in the same way you're creating your project, comes the answer to the original question. How much do you stretch your swatch? And the answer is you're going to block your swatch the same as you intend on blocking your final project. So in this question, it was a shawl. And if you intend on blocking that shawl aggressively, then you need to block your swatch aggressively. If you intend on just laying it out and smoothing it, then you just lay out the swatch and smooth it. So that's the answer. If you are working on something, say you're working on a blanket, an acrylic blanket, or a blended wool acrylic blanket, or whatever you're going to do, or a cotton blanket, and your plan with this is the blocking is going to be throwing it in the washing machine and then throwing it in the dryer, that's what you need to do to your swatch. It needs to go in the washing machine and then it needs to go in the dryer, because that is how you're blocking the final thing. When I've worked with linen, the difference between blocking linen just gently or carefully, like I do wool, just soaking it and spinning it out and then pinning it, the difference in blocking it that way and blocking it by throwing it in the washing machine and throwing it in the dryer, huge, the difference between those swatches, because linen actually likes that kind of abuse. So, well, I don't know, abuse. It's just, it doesn't need gentle, tender, loving care. Linen thrives in a harsh environment, shall we say. So you need to block your swatch as you're intending to block your finished project. And we covered the types of tools you're going to use. Again, got to use the right same materials. I have seen people who are working on, like, they start and they swatch and they start one of these shawls that starts small and gets longer and longer, and like they have it on like a 20-inch needle, and I'll talk to them and I'll be like, you know, you're going to need a much longer needle for that particular project. And if it's not an interchangeable, if you can't swap out or add to that cable that's holding it together, you're going to need to switch to another needle, but that needle needs to be the same kind of needle. Again, you can't start out on a Knit Picks or Knitter's Pride Pro nickel plated needle, and then once you run out of cable, switch over to a wooden needle. Or just because it's the same number size does not mean it's going to give you the same gauge. And even switching between metal and metal, it's not necessarily going to give you the same gauge. Now, in a shawl, that's not a huge deal. In a sweater, it might be. In a sweater, it might be the difference between a sleeve that's that long and a sleeve that's that long. I mean, you know how that works. So make sure you use all of the same tools, materials, and techniques that you're going to use to create your finished project and finish your project, because I want to include blocking. Now that we got that, a couple other tips. So, no, maybe only one other tip, because I kind of pushed that one in with that. I'm kind of, I said I don't do good luck with this. Go big or go home. When you're making a swatch, make it big. Don't like try to eke out the smallest amount of swatch. When I was working in a store, I would have people come in and they would be like, hey, can you help me check gauge? And I was always perfectly happy to do that. I'd get out my gauge ruler because sometimes it's hard to count the stitches and sometimes it's hard to count the rows. And then they would pull out their gauge swatch, which was approximately 1/2 inch of stockinette, about this wide, still on the needle. And I'd be like, no, there's literally 0 point in me trying to count that for you. There's 0 point. Well, obviously, if it's still on the needle, it hasn't been blocked. But regardless of that, it's only 1/2 inch tall. There's not enough there to measure. You need to make a big swatch. If your gauge information is supplied to you by the pattern and it says X number of stitches and X number of rows in 4 inches, you need to make a 5 to 6 inch square swatch. So what I tend to do is if it says 25 stitches equals 4 inches, I cast on 30 to 35 stitches, and then I knit a couple of rows of garter, and then I switch to stockinette, but keeping garter on the edges, like 2 rows on either side so it doesn't curl. And then I knit until it looks roughly square. And then I do a couple more rows of garter, and then I bind it off. Now, at this point, you don't necessarily have to cut your yarn, okay? I have been known to take a locking stitch marker, lock down that last bound off stitch, and block this puppy still attached to my yarn because I do get concerned about whether or not I'm going to run out of yarn. You can cut that and block it, and we'll talk about that in a second. But what you end up with is a good size swatch, or it needs to be in the round if you're knitting in the round. You Google swatching in the round. Go up into YouTube, and after you finish watching my video, go up into YouTube and Google for swatching in the round videos. There are tips and people who have made videos on that. I haven't made one yet. But it needs to be big enough so that you can measure those 4 inches without interference from any of the edges. Okay? And so you need to be able to measure 4 inches of row and 4 inches of row in stitch gauge. I look like I'm voguing. You got to do that without interference from the edges because your tension changes when you get to the edges. And that's just one of those things. You lay down your rigid measuring device. Do not ever, well, again, I don't forbid anything. It is not recommended by me to measure with one of these jobbies. I mean, I use these all the time, but for this, you don't want this because they're flexible and they can shift and they can move and you can kind of make them say what you want them to do, and they can change over time depending on what type you have. Use a rigid ruler. There are gauge measuring devices that are absolutely fantastic, and I think I have a video on those. They're ones that have little windows that are the specific width, or you can just use a ruler. It really is not integral to have a gauge swatch thingamajigger, but they are useful. And then what you're wanting to do is count the number of stitches or rows in that 4 inch space. So you put it down without wiggling anything and you count the stitches, and then you write it down, and then you flip it and you count the rows. What we are not doing is casting on 25 stitches, knitting 20 rows, and then trying to block it to make it 4 inches. It is measuring the stitch count within the space after. We're not measuring the size of the swatch. Okay? We're not measuring the size of the swatch. We are measuring the number of stitches or rows per inch. And it can be anywhere on that piece of fabric because it should be consistent. And here is another little pro tip, and it's the thing that I thought of when the original question came up and I responded in Facebook. I can't like guarantee 100% of the time, but I can tell you that as a designer, the gauge that I put on the pattern is not measured from a swatch. It is a measurement taken directly from the finished blocked project. Like this, I measured, so I'm using this huge piece of fabric that I am measuring from. And frequently I will count it in multiple different locations to make sure it's consistent. But so this is why I say the gauge swatch needs to be processed just like the project, because the information the designer is giving you is based on their finished project. So that's one of the things I really wanted to mention. Okay, so I could talk so much about gauge, y'all. You have no idea. This is just the basics, okay? And one little thing: do not, under any circumstances, as a shortcut, have someone else knit your gauge swatch. I never thought I needed to tell someone that, but sometimes some people need to be told that. That is not a shortcut. No one else can knit your gauge swatch. It also, when I say you have to use all the same tools as you're going to use on the finished project, that includes your own hands. Okay. Okay, so knit your gauge swatch as you are going to knit your finished project, including and up to finishing and blocking, and go big or go home. Make a large swatch. Now, you can make your swatch as big as you want. People who are afraid of running out of yarn, if you are on gauge, you shouldn't run out of yarn if you have the amount of yarn called for in the pattern. That is one of the reasons you should do a gauge swatch, is because all of the calculations on how much yarn you need are based on that specific gauge. But if you are concerned about running out of yarn, and there are people who ask, does the yarn requirements include the gauge swatch? I can't answer that question. I can't answer that question. I can't answer it for all designers. As I said, usually the measurements are coming off of the finished product, but I would assume usually the designer has knit a swatch, but I don't know if they frogged it. You can frog your swatch, okay? It is not a problem to frog your swatch, okay? It has been blocked, so it's gonna knit like spaghetti. And typically, if you're desperate enough to frog your swatch, you're only like needing bind off, because you're not going to get a lot. There's not going to be a lot of yarn in that swatch, but you can pull it out. You can take out your bind off, frog it, and attach it in if you are desperate for yarn. But that's only if you're really playing yarn chicken, because the amount of yarn in a swatch is not going to be that much. Unless you're like me and I'm swatching. I literally had, for my bulky yarn book, I knit one swatch that took an entire skein. But the thing is, it was bulky yarn and the skein was only 75 yards. And I made a swatch like this big. It was a blanket. So I made it big. I made like a baby blanket size swatch. So it happens. So there. That's a question a lot of people have about gauge swatches. Yes, you can frog them and use them like at the tail end of something. So hopefully, even if this is all a recap for you, you at least enjoyed the video and maybe are thinking a little bit more favorably about your gauge swatch. I, again, could talk much longer, but should probably stop here. We're at like almost 30 minutes. So I don't know if anybody's listened to half an hour of me ranting about gauge. Thank you very much to the original poster who put this question into the Watch Barbara Knit Facebook group that made me think of this and gave me the inspiration for this video. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, click that like button. And if you would like to be notified whenever I upload a new video, please subscribe to my channel and select notifications, click that little bell. Thank you so much. Answer is, you're going to block your swatch. You can frog your swatch. This is not a problem to frog your swatch.